Welcome back to the One Another podcast. My name is Josh Squires, and I'm your host. And with me, as usual, is my co-host, Josh Fleming. Josh, welcome.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
And our guest, Mary Louise Bowers. Mary Louise, thanks for being with us.
Always glad to be with you. I'm just like Josh.
Yeah.
There you
Happy to be here.
So we've been looking
Joshes.
at...
Because he's just like Josh.
It doesn't matter
You know?
which. Yeah, just like the Joshes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're now on episode 7 of a season
right.
that nobody's going to watch. And so we've been talking about sins, kind of 10 sins that people struggle with that we see in our various ministry areas.
Right.
What sin are we on today?
Today we are talking about anxiety, but particularly, we want to make sure we make this distinction, unrighteous anxiety, correct?
Unrighteous.
Unrighteous. So that brings up the question right off the bat. What is the difference between anxiety that would be considered righteous or appropriate and what is anxiety that is unrighteous? I guess we need to understand what anxiety is, and then what do those nuances look like?
Yeah, that's great. Because it is important that we be able to say, like all emotions, there is the ability for each emotion to have an expression that is righteous and an expression that is unrighteous.
Right.
So if we were to look at Christ in the garden on the eve of his crucifixion, and he's experiencing whatever he's experiencing that's described as this profuse sweating and tension, right? I'm going to read a definition here in a second of anxiety. It seems like that might fit
That might be right.
what we would describe there. And so we want to make sure we carve out a section that's like Christ is free to experience that and it not be sin.
Right.
Right.
It's completely appropriate for the circumstances. Yeah.
That's right. So we want to acknowledge that there is such a thing as unrighteous anxiety because there needs to be such a thing as righteous anxiety, regardless of how often we see it, if we ever see the righteous.
That's a good question. Yeah. How often do we actually experience the righteous? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So let's start with just some basic definitions. And I'm going to read for you a couple of definitions because I think it's helpful. This requires nuance, right? Luckily, we're in a culture that does really well with nuance.
That's right. We're totally accustomed to that all the time.
Really good with it, especially on this format.
Right.
Yeah. So this is going to take us a minute to kind of maybe unpack before we're able to move on. So let me give you a couple of definitions. The first one is going to be a more clinical definition, but it's coming from Merriam-Webster. The second one is going to come from the American Psychological Association. So first one from Merriam-Webster. An abnormal and overwhelming sense of apprehension and fear, often marked by physical signs, and then parens, such as tension, sweating, and increased pulse rate, in parens, by doubt concerning the reality and nature of a threat, and by self-doubt about one's capacity to cope with it. That's a big definition, right? But the elements are a sense of apprehension and fear, physical symptomology about some sort of threat out in the future, and an unsuredness about my ability to make it through. Right? And so again, we think about Christ and we think about the angels ministering to him. Was he unsure that he was going to be able to make it through? Probably not, but it was a very fearful, and he needed ministry to him in that moment. Okay, well, now listen to the American Psychological Association. First off, they say anxiety and fear are different things, though they're often confused for one another. Anxiety is considered a future-oriented, long-acting response, broadly focused on a diffuse threat. Again, we'll come back and talk about all that because it's very kind of technical language. Whereas fear is an appropriate, present-oriented, and short-lived response to a clearly identifiable and specific threat.
Okay.
So what they're saying is that anxiety is a broad, future-oriented rather than this specific thing that's present-oriented, right? And continues to go around and be something that we struggle with over a long term versus fear is in the moment. Let me give you an illustration, something that they might use. If you heard a gunshot in the room right next door, what would you do? Well, you would have a fear response, not an anxiety response, right? Because all of a sudden you're afraid for your life and you're nervous system is firing so that you
Right.
can fight or flight.
And there's an immediate specific threat that you're aware of.
That's
right?
present, right? Versus if you have read about workplace violence and now you're afraid to go to work because you're afraid there might in some future
Sure. It could happen one day.
it could
right?
happen.
Yeah, yeah.
That's exactly right. And so they want to make a difference between fear and anxiety in that way. Truth be told, we tend to use both words kind of interchangeably.
Right.
Right? And so we want to be able to speak to we'll generally use the anxiety as that sort of long-term broad threat, but we want to be able to speak to both kind of fear and anxiety
as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, when we talk about what's going on. Now, the definitions, while confusing, is fear a part of it or not a part of it? And Merriam-Webster, they say a sense of apprehension or fear. And the American Psychological Association says, no, fear's something different.
Pull that out. Yeah. It's different.
Yeah, right. We experience oftentimes very similar internal experiences of fear and anxiety, right? And so it's a lot about object, right? And how present that object is, and how real versus forecasted
Right.
that object is in order to get between fear and anxiety. If that's true, then the question becomes, well, is all anxiety really just unrighteous? If it's all about some future broad thing, then is it that there is no example outside of Christ where there would be anxiety that is righteous? And really, Scripture's clear-ish on this, and like you can.
I love that.
Yeah, clear-ish.
Clear-ish seems like a bit of an oxymoron.
Well, because the places where it speaks directly sometimes seem like it's really, really clear, black and white. And yet there's also nuance here. So let's look at real quickly just the scriptures that one would use.
Sure.
If you were thinking about, okay, all anxiety
If you're
is
saying
sin.
black and white, you'd point here. Yeah.
That's right. And there are people that we love and respect. Jerry Bridges would be one of them. Jerry Bridges, I love his books on grace. He's one of my favorite Baptists that wrote, and I am 100% sure I'll see him in glory and will enjoy my time with him, right? But he writes a book, and a book that I actually really enjoy and often give to people, Respectable Sins.
Right.
Right? It's super helpful, and actually very similar in this vein, sins that we kind of struggle with. And he would say all anxiety is sin.
Gotcha.
Black and white. Why would he say that? Well, he would say that because of scriptures like Philippians 4:6, right? Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Again, notice the beginning of that. Do not be anxious about anything.
Seems pretty black and white.
Seems pretty black
You
and
could make
white.
an argument from that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Right. Or Christ, Matthew 6:25.
Yeah.
Right? When he's talking about, he's just got done talking about not serving mammon, right? And his very next thing, he'll say, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing, right? So again, it seems very clear. He says, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, right? So it's like, okay. It seems,
There you have it.
Yeah, pretty black and white. However, and this is an example that's not Christ, an example of someone having a concern that seems to be almost an anxiety that's actually commendable. And that's going to be Timothy. In Philippians 2:20, Paul is saying, I am sending to you Timothy. And what is the commending attribute? Why Timothy over anybody else? Because he is genuinely concerned for your welfare. That's what it says. Except that the word we translate for genuinely concerned is the exact same word as do not be this about anything, right? So there seems to be, as black and white as it appears, there seems to be some subtlety here that allows for there to be room for there to be a righteous version of this.
Sure.
Why would his anxiety or worry be a righteous anxiety? Well, his object of his anxiety is not his own life. I'm not worried about my food. I'm not worried about my clothing. I'm not worried about where I'm going to lay my head. I'm not worried about maintaining a style of life. I'm not worried about my kids doing something. My worry is about the kingdom, its growth, and the people of the kingdom, right? So that sort of experience that also trusts the Lord, right? So it's object and then it's source of trust. Okay, I trust the Lord that he's going to use the appropriate means to shepherd his people. And yet, humanly speaking, I am concerned about the growth of the kingdom.
Right.
And to have that sort of anxiety where you're anxious about the word going forth and reaching people groups and churches and whether or not they're staying true to the word, that seems to be a sort of anxiety that is righteous. The Lord gives us this experience, this human lived experience, in order to produce in us a care for his people, his word, and his kingdom.
Yeah, it's an anxiety that produces prayerfulness, that produces faithful gospel ministry, that sort of thing. Paul uses the same, I think it's 2 Corinthians 11. He's going through and listing all these issues, and he talks about his own constant, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's concern, depending on the translation, but it's the same Greek word as well. So he even says he's got it, Timothy's got it. So there does seem to be, a very appropriate outworking or outpouring of this emotion.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's not about myself, it's not about my clothes or my what I'm going to eat, as Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6. So yeah.
The third category, so it's object, it's source. So where's my trust? Is it me or is it the Lord? And the third would be intensity, right? What is it doing? Is it helping me to be more the kingdom worker I'm called to be, or is it shutting me down and making me less the kingdom worker that I'm called to be? In clinical terms, they talk about the differences between stress, EU stress, kind of like we would talk about a eulogy in a funeral. A eulogy, EU, is a good word. That's right. Stress is good stress. And people oftentimes like, wait, what? I've only thought of stress as bad, right? But the good stress is the stress that says, if I don't get up, get a shower, and get to work, I might lose my job. And then I won't be able to pay my bills, right? That's good stress. The stress that says, I can't get out of this bed because I'm afraid something bad will happen, is distress. It's negative stress that inhibits me from being able to do what I'm called to do as a kingdom worker. So that was a long, I think we went over 10 minutes there of Squires just trying to
nuance and
build the case. But I think it's important that we don't just say all anxiety is sinful, fear is okay. Actually, there's a way in which each of these can have righteous and unrighteous expressions.
Sure. But the reality is, and I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, is that typically what we see, boots on the ground, most people, the anxiety they experience is going to be much more of that me-centered, the focus about my life, that sort of thing. I'm thinking of the ministry with young adults, and it's things about anxiety about career path or
who you're going to marry,
relationship. Yeah, exactly. Future family, all these sorts of things that are not unimportant, and they're important parts of your life. But if they cause that sort of, like you're saying, that debilitating, that distress, then it's not appropriate.
That's right. Because the object is my life, and the source is like, what do I trust? I trust myself, or I trust you to give me the answer, so that I can suss out the right thing, that I can find that right job, find that right relationship, versus the trust being the Lord, right? And it's causing me enough fear and tension that I'm unable to be the person that I feel like I'm called to be, right? I keep cycling on this thing. It keeps bothering me. Okay, all of those push us towards the unrighteous version of anxiety. Reminds me of a professor who said, there is such a thing as righteous anxiety. I've just never seen it.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's probably right.
And that's similar to other things that we've talked about. Anger, for instance, comes to mind.
Yep.
We know that righteous anger is possible. We know that the Lord gets righteously angry. But in terms of our ability to be angry and not sin, we're just very limited in that. When I think about anxiety, I think a lot of times it's the idea that if I can spend enough time thinking about what might go wrong, I could prevent what could go wrong. And I think, I'll say as a mom who's sort of just getting out of the young children stage, there's a lot of like, well, I don't want you to go play outside because what if, X, Y, and Z happen? And we put those limitations on. Some of that, concern is valid.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Others, other facets of it are that sort of Eve nature desire for control.
Yep.
But do y'all see that in men too, where it's this desire to prevent anything from possibly going wrong?
Sure. I think maybe it's like anything else. There's going to be people who struggle with it more than others. I think, everyone wants control of their environment and the things that are happening in their life on some level. And so if I can say, I'll just eliminate all the bad possibilities and options out there by worrying about it, then I think that's something people will struggle with.
And I think there's personality pieces here where certain personalities that are really good at forecasting, that like a plan and a backup plan and a backup to the backup plan sort of, right? That's not me. I'm a by the seat of my pants sort of guy, right?
I didn't know that about you, Josh.
Yeah, it's kind of odd. But I married a plan with a backup plan, but a backup plan sort of person, and I needed that in my life. Sure. Praise the Lord for it. But those personalities probably struggle more with anxiety because they can forecast how this decision might affect that thing that might affect that thing that ultimately puts me on this trajectory that I don't like, right? And to be able to say, okay, I can only make the decision for right now and then trust the Lord with the rest. And I think that they're gonna struggle more with that. And when we think about like what promises this sin particular makes to the heart, I think preparation to avoid potential catastrophe is the number one. And then number two is that I can somehow pre-grieve any bad thing that could happen. Right? I can kind of prepare myself for the worst because I assume the worst is coming. And that's impossible. You can never pre-grieve.
Right.
And the worst doesn't always happen. And so you're mortgaging the future for a whole bunch of grief that you may not even have to endure, right? But if I can think about it and kind of get myself prepped for it, then should I face loss of a spouse, loss of a kid, loss of a job, something like that, then I'm going to be more willing and able to make it through, right? And it's just like, no, you're just going to have to make it through if that comes.
Right.
And, one thing that really stood out to me at one point, because, I've had a lot of these conversations over the years, and to the degree of sometimes women will say, everything's going really well right now, so I'm nervous for when the bottom is going to go out.
Yeah.
When the shoe's going to fall, sort of
Yeah.
speak.
Right.
Yeah.
And, some of that is valid because what we know as believers is that we're promised trials and suffering.
Right.
And so when things seem to be going pretty well, there is a natural sense of like, wait, okay, so where's the suffering? Because I know I'm going to face it.
Yeah.
But we can excessively anticipate that.
That's right.
And it can be really difficult to sit back and say, I'm going to rejoice in the Lord today.
Yeah.
No matter my circumstances, be they good or difficult. And that really takes discipline. So it's easy to kind of do what you're doing, saying, Josh, like sort of pre-grieve things. It's almost like, okay, what do I need to be doing now for whenever the bottom is about to fall out?
And you try to hold in tension those two truths. One that is, we have a Father who loves to give his children good gifts. He doesn't give you a stone when you ask for bread. Right? That is so true. He loves us so much, and he loves giving us good things. And at the same time, one of the good things that he gives us is suffering, because suffering produces hope, right? And so that's a hard tension sometimes for us to walk. And when everything's going well, like you said, that anticipation of like, okay, this is just a brief respite from the storm, especially if you've had a life where you've faced very significant things early or often. That feels, the respite just feels like an illusion. It doesn't feel like safety or reality, right?
How do we, encourage people who have suffered early and often, how do we help encourage them to enjoy that respite when it comes?
Well, I mean, I think you want to help them see how the seasons of suffering, while difficult, also help them to know and love the Lord more, so that those seasons in and of themselves weren't just seasons they had to endure, they were productive seasons. And those productive seasons then produce the sort of hope and the sort of safety and security upon which you can anchor yourself no matter where you're at, no matter what seas come. And therefore, you've got this kind of idea of a sea anchor. That's the writer of Hebrews will use that analogy. And a sea anchor was an anchor you put down in the middle of a storm to help orient your bow towards the waves so that you would go through them and wouldn't be swamped over by them, right? So I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to use the hope that is produced in the suffering that they have experienced previously to help them focus not on their current circumstances, but the goodness of God. Mm-hmm. Right? And that God is working something even in the suffering. Now, that's difficult. You don't want to just play the, hey, you're ungrateful. You want to be compassionate. You want to be kind to the suffering that they've experienced in life.
Right.
And yet you want to be able to gently, compassionately highlight for them even God's work in those moments. And then secondly, and this is going back to Philippians 4, Paul's example is, what do you do when you're anxious? Well, you give thanks. You pray with thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. And so you're in this season that feels like just a temporary season until the next hard thing hits. What do you do in order to increase a sense of peace and a sense of security? Well, you increase your thanksgiving. And so going and being able to audit what is making this season a good, safe season, and then bringing those to the Lord and kind of counting them and thanking Him for them one by one is a helpful way to try and gain rest without having to anticipate what's coming next.
Yeah, I mean, it really is helpful to remember like something that we can actually do, right? That helps get our minds in the right place where we're focused rather than our focus being on the world and our temporary circumstances, getting our focus on the Lord. And I think that's actually one of the ways I think this sin manifests itself is through getting our focus on the world and our circumstances in it. Yep. Another way I think it manifests itself is through prayerlessness, which is exactly what you're talking about too, where, what we're, and this is true regardless of if you're somebody who's experienced suffering early and often, or if you're somebody who, for whom suffering really hasn't been a huge part of your story. Yep. Our temptation is to think, well, I don't really need to pray about it, or I've got this.
Yeah, right.
And then when some big emergency comes, then it's like 911 prayer. But that's actually the opposite of what God's saying. It's like the way to experience peace is through abundant prayer. Yeah. The way to experience peace is by keeping our gaze fixed on Him. Let's not forget Peter walking on water, right?
Yeah.
Just you want to be like, come on, dude, just keep your eyes on Jesus.
Yeah. So you mentioned prayerlessness as an example of what it looks like in our lives. And if I go back and I kind of audit Scripture and say, what does this look like in the lives of characters inside of the Bible? One of the first examples that kind of jumps off the page is Abraham and Sarah. That they wanted to wrest control. And I think that's where a lot of us struggles. Like, how do no, Lord, I trust you, but also let me do something as well in order to make myself feel better. And Abraham and Sarah were promised progeny. They were promised children. And after that didn't come about for years, they said, oh, I know, we have this plan. Instead of me, Sarah, being the one, how about Hagar, right? And they thought that they could help along God's plan. And that turned out incredibly poorly, right? Yeah. And so I think that as we think about them, and we want to judge not too harshly, but as we think about them, their desire to take control, to wrest control from the Lord in the midst of a plan that's a long developing plan sometimes, right? Is to instead continue, not that there's anything wrong with diligence and trying to think through a good plan, but continue to trust the promises of the Lord rather than to try and wrest that control back into our own hands.
That's right. Because, I mean, if you think about that example, they were still seeking the goal that was promised, right? It's like, well, we're going to get this child for us, but it wasn't trusting God's way to get it. And so that's the thing. We will often say, well, I'm going to trust God for his promises.
Yeah.
But he could probably use a little help here, and he's busy.
Yep.
I don't want to bother him with it,
World peace, cancer.
There's all these big things out there. So I can, grease the skids a little bit here and get things moving because I've got some ideas.
That's right.
Because I'm thinking a lot about it. I'm not sure how much time he's spending on it.
Yeah.
I was in Sunday school recently, and the Sunday school teacher was just confessing that his instinct is, rather than to walk in the good paths that God has set out for him, it's to invite God to walk in the good paths that he has set out for God to come alongside him. And I think that is kind of what we see here with Hagar and Abraham and Sarah. I mean, you do wonder what Hagar was thinking through the whole thing, but and we just don't know. But, I have to be careful before I judge Abraham and Sarah too harshly because I know that I have a similar instinct to try to fix the problem. And, in fact, you see actually pretty great patience where they've waited,
years.
some number of years.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, we may be actually inclined to, wait a couple weeks and, you're going, where is God? Where I don't see him here. And that makes us anxious. And so it's like, for a moment I felt like God was near.
Yeah.
I felt like I think I heard God say that he promised to do this, but right now it doesn't really feel like God is here. And so there's a question too of how do we encourage people around us or even ourselves, when it doesn't feel like God's promises are true, and that's anxiety producing.
Yeah. The answer that Paul continues to give about praying and praying without ceasing, so it's how we talk to the Lord, right? We hear him talk to us through his word, and we talk to him through prayer, which creates this sense of connectedness. And so oftentimes when we say, I don't feel the presence of the Lord, it doesn't feel like he's with me, it's often a sign that we're not communicating very much. Let's pause that relationship for 1 second and even go to relationships like our marriages. And sometimes when it begins to feel like we're living these parallel lives rather than interconnected lives, what's going on? We're not spending much time together. We're not communicating together. We're just trying to get to the end, to this goal together, right? And the same thing happens with the Lord, where we stop listening to his word, we quit praying to him, and we're just trying to reach whatever goal, which is the promise that we have in our mind, that certainly has an expression that we have in our own mind. This is what the goodness of your promise looks like to me.
Right.
It's me with a good life, with plenty of children and grandchildren and a beautiful house and a beautiful whatever, rather than moment by moment staying in communion and relationship with him. And so whenever anyone comes to me and says, I don't feel like God is here and he's not listening, my answer tends to be a compassionate one. I'm so sorry, brother or sister. It's so difficult when we experience a lack of presence with God. Know that your emotions aren't the arbiters of reality. God is still with you. He's with you every single moment. That's his promise. I wonder if we can look at how are we trying to be connected to him, not just how is he trying to be connected to us, right? And so are we praying to him, and are we reading his word and applying it to our heart regularly?
I love applying the gospel to these kinds of situations. Because what we see really in Abraham and Sarah and plenty of other biblical examples is God's patience with us and our anxiety. Yes, Abraham and Sarah made a mess, but God still accomplished his purposes miraculously. And, we talk in our family, I like to say there are two things that we say all the time. And one, we say hashtag togetherness. And that's like, you're in the van, all six of us for 10 hours straight. And we're like, hashtag togetherness. Isn't this great, everybody? But the other is a little bit more serious note. And I don't know if this is just like being a mom of daughters. I really don't know what it's like to raise boy children. But we talk a lot about being strong and courageous. And even this morning in the car, we were talking about how God didn't just tell Joshua one time to be strong and courageous, but he told him multiple times to be strong and courageous.
Yep.
And I tend to think if Joshua felt like, well, God's called me to go destroy Jericho, and, so I got this, no big deal. If he thought it was a breeze, he wouldn't have God wouldn't have been required to tell him over and over and over again, be strong and courageous.
Yeah.
And so it's really lovely to remember in the midst of our anxiety, in the midst of our self-doubt, that God is patient with us, that he meets us there, that he encourages us to be strong, to be courageous in him.
Yep.
And it's a beautiful exchange where he says, hey, give me your burden.
Mm-hmm.
And in exchange, I'll give you back my peace.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just worthy of trust. The one who says, give me your worst and I give you my best really is worthy of our trust.
Yeah. I think that word is a really key word. There's a guy by the name of John Gottman. He's a professor emeritus, University of Washington, really trustworthy of the psychologist by way of how he does his research. But he says that trust is knowing you are for me even when it costs you. And even though Gottman isn't a believer, I think he's hit on a really, really gospel-centered definition of trust, right? Because God is so for us that he was willing to basically pay the ultimate cost, the cost of his life, to take on not only physical death, but spiritual death, and that we might have fellowship with him. He didn't stand in need of anything. As the Trinity, he was perfect in glory, perfect in fellowship, perfect in every way that is conceivable, and yet chose to create and redeem in a way that cost him that we might gain all of that from him. There's no one more trustworthy. How silly is it of us then to say, okay, I don't trust you, God. I'm going to wrest control back to me, right?
Yeah, you haven't proven yourself. You haven't put any skin in the game.
What have you done?
Right, yeah.
I'm like, we were the ones who messed it up in the first place.
That's right.
I don't know why we think we're going to do a good job.
Yeah. We're always bringing the problems, not the solutions.
Right.
Yet we want to suggest solutions as though we know best, and we simply do not.
Yeah.
But trust is, you're right. I think that's a great definition he has. The impulse there of like that gospel impulse, even within that sort of, I guess, secular definition is so strong that even when I know, even when it's going to cost.
Yeah.
Because God has proven, even when it costs.
And that's our fear, right? That when I'm not bringing enough to the table in this relationship, when I'm not offering enough, that you're going to forget me. And that's what that works righteousness mentality does to us. It trips us up and it says, God loves you unless you're not good enough. You're kind of anxious. You might be missing the mark here. It's like, no, God loves you in spite of the fact that you missed the mark. And even while you were missing the mark, he sacrificed for you. What a lovely Savior we have.
Yeah, and such a love, such a lavish, it really is astonishing what we're saying a minute ago. Like, you're pointing out how God didn't need to do any of that. It didn't improve his glory. He wasn't in need of worship. Wasn't in need of people his creation to love him back. That he would do that, it really should just astonish. Like, we sing Amazing Grace, but do we really get how amazing it is? As we start to taste little bits and pieces of it, though, that's the sort of thing that just casts our silly little fears and anxieties so far away, because we're like, oh, wait a minute, you're telling me it's that good?
Yeah.
What am I messing with this other little stuff? Why do we even care about these other things?
Well, what it does is it alleviates those two sources that we said, this is what makes anxiety unrighteous. Source, where's my trust? Well, I know I can trust a God who's willing to die for me,
right,
that I might be his. What is the object? I'm fine. I've got his love. I know where I'm headed. I'm headed to a place where all things will be made new, where there will be no tears, no disease, no sadness, right? So I don't have to worry about me. Now I'm free to only worry about the kingdom, and that people would also experience the same thing that I do, right? That's amazing. That undercuts that sort of unrighteous anxiety if we will just apply the gospel regularly to our lives. And let's be honest. All of us struggle with anxiety.
Absolutely.
And an unrighteous version of anxiety.
Absolutely.
So this is not three people who don't struggle with this.
We get
Quite
it.
the
Talking to
opposite.
cameras. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Oh boy.
Well, we thank you for joining us for another episode here at the One Another podcast. Please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. You can follow us on Instagram at One Another Podcast, or you can email us 1a@firstprescolumbia.org. Again, that's 1a@firstprescolumbia.org. For Josh and Mary Louise, I'm Josh Squires, and we'll see you next time.